Here is a convicted trespasser we're about to explain. You see spot shadowed there from the January 6th attack. You could see him pushing forward. This is brazenly passing police lines to break into the Capitol that day. Evidence shows he also gathered apparent weapons by breaking apart metal fencing, hiding it in his pants pocket. And that's something he's actually admitted, speaking of accountability, in his legal case. His name is Charles Hand. He's a 37-year-old January 6th convict from Georgia. He is the kind of person that the Republican Party has claimed for many decades should not even be able to vote. The party at the state level has stripped voting rights from millions and millions of people based on exactly these kind of criminal records. Donald Trump, if you want to go to the current party leader, has claimed he opposes voting rights for felons. But now, as Trump leads his party towards embracing January 6 felons and other criminals, and even those convicted of super serious and grave and rare crimes like sedition that day, Donald Trump's Republican Party not only welcomes January 6 convicts voting, right, which is a total reversal and hypocritical and quite obvious, but also welcomes them as leaders of their movement, able to make policy, to be on ballots, to be in government. Some Republicans are backing these lawbreakers' quest, including the one you see on your screen here, to become lawmakers. To, and I say this quite literally, to re-enter the Capitol they once illegally stormed, to re-enter it as Republican legislators. This is the top story tonight because that convict just made it to the final step of a primary runoff for a U.S. House seat from the state of Georgia. And he'll face off with another candidate next month. This is the kind of political process that other failed democracies have seen. We as a country are no better or worse than what other countries and societies and people go through, but sometimes it does help some people to understand it that way. So we've seen this happen in other places. It does not end well, where the criminals and the autocrats who actually oppose democracy begin infiltrating the government. And sometimes it happens before the entire democracy fails. Here's another January 6th defendant facing allegations of bringing a gun to the insurrection and shooting it. That is no joke. That right there is a crime in the District of Columbia. That person is one of over 1,400 defendants facing charges or trials related to Jan 6. Many of them, though, we should mention, have been convicted. They've reached plea deals. Some have taken responsibility. Many have said in public as part of that process that they were wrong to believe Trump's lies, or they believed it then and they don't believe it anymore. Again, as part of why the picture is complicated tonight, and whether that makes for a better or more exciting story is not supposed to be our concern in journalism. I just want to tell you the nuance. One recently told the court, turns out the election was not stolen. That was an oath keeper facing responsibility and accountability in January 6th sentencing. And I'll tell you, even if you don't believe that person, if you think they only were saying what's true to try to get a lighter sentence, I'll remind you that's part of how the criminal justice system works. We don't bust out lie detectors and do psychological searches on everyone's mind. The system does reward people who say the right thing and the true thing combined with other efforts to take responsibility, like taking a plea. So that's one reaction. But as the Republican Party rallies to Trump's more brazen embrace of January 6, we're seeing real in-court ramifications going the other way. Take this defendant openly announcing he's above the law because he expects a pardon from Trump in about 6 months. This is real, if you haven't heard about this yet. Quote, Trump's going to be in office in 6 months, so I have nothing to worry about, said by a defendant to a judge during arraignment. That is a truly anti-law and order view, and it is fomented by Trump. The quote says it's directly from Trump, right? And Trump is now running more blatantly against the rule of law than even in his past campaigns. We know that on January 6th, Trump welcomed the crowd. We know he didn't try to stop the violence that day. You remember that. By the end of the day, he was pushed into telling people after they'd ransacked the place and called for assassinations of Pence and Pelosi and done all the other things we remember. He did eventually say, go home. And at that point, after the deed was done, he talked up peace. At the time, that seemed like a low point. But I want to be clear with you. In measurable ways, he has now gone far lower. The nonpartisan Associated Press recently reporting Trump now makes defending the January 6th attack a, quote, cornerstone of his White House bid. And it's closing the circle on his own involvement. Remember, I bet you're old enough to remember when one of the conspiracy theory defenses was it was somebody else. It was Antifa. It was a bad thing, but it was liberals. That was a lie. They gave that up. Now they say not only did they do it and Jan 6 people are okay or they are persecuted, they did it, and now they're trying to sometimes argue it was effectively okay or even a good thing, quote unquote. Trump literally honors these defendants and convicts at his rallies. He falsely refers to them as hostages. That is not what they are. And an announcer sometimes plays their singing rendition of the national anthem.
Please rise for the horribly and unfairly treated January 6th hostages.
That is eerie. That is the disembodied voice of people in prison singing. That's all for the people who stormed the Capitol. This week, the same nonpartisan Associated Press reported election deniers are closer to the GOP mainstream in Congress. I told you about that one candidate. And Americans are learning some of the Supreme Court justices who take an oath to be impartial actually flew a flag cheering on the insurrection in the days after, meaning after they saw the violence. So the conservative right has grown more extreme on this issue than ever. The lies that fed the insurrection are, for example, what Justice Alito was caught appearing to support by flying that upside-down American flag, a symbol of the, quote, Stop the Steal effort. Alito realizes how guilty he looks, so he's not actually defending that, unlike, say, a Republican congressional candidate. He now claims that his wife flew the flag without his involvement or knowledge, but since he lives there, that explanation sounds misleading at best. It raises questions over whether he should recuse from any related cases or be put under oath about his now several scandals, as some call for him to be off the court entirely. Then there's a new speaker who went from warning that Trump was unfit for office to joining the lies about Jan 6. Speaker Johnson claimed that he wanted to help a cover-up to hide the faces of the people who illegally stormed the Capitol. This is a claim he later walked back.
I made a commitment immediately after I got the gavel that we would start releasing that. Originally, we were trying to blur some of the faces to protect the innocent, people who were just there and just happened to be walking through the building.
False. The people arrested were not people who happened to be walking through the building that day, which Johnson knows because he was there and which you can see on your screen. This went on for hours of what you see here. This was actually while the police were still holding some of the line. This other footage is at one of the doorways. This went on for hours. The footage is disturbing. The police were brutally attacked over and over by those Trump fans. These are the people, among others, that Trump is talking about pardoning. And the broader timeline we've shown you before, I want to remind you, the GOP went from what you see back in 21, calling this an un-American insurrection, to later having the RNC claim it was legitimate speech, to then what you see on the right, the new Speaker Johnson going even farther, to the RNC now only wanting to hire election deniers. That's the political lens on the bottom. Above it, you have what I told you is that mixed picture, others convicted, other accountability in the judicial branch. The timeline plots several points. The big takeaway is that the Republican political arm is different from our justice system. They are splitting. But the political arm is on record opposing the rule of law, democracy, and law and order. That's the political problem. As for the other lens I told you about, there is justice accountability, especially in the federal prosecution in courts and some of the state probes that took a little longer to get started. I'm showing you here some of the many Trump aides and lawyers punished, prosecuted, or even now convicted, all for related cases at the state or federal level, either stonewalling or trying to steal the election. Trump White House vet Peter Navarro is in prison right now. Steve Bannon is headed there on similar charges, just affirmed by an appeals court. Arizona prosecutors just held new arraignments for Giuliani and other Trump allies indicted for trying to steal the 2020 race. And that includes Trump attorney Christina Bobb. And she is a defendant who holds an Orwellian spot on the National Republican Party's election integrity team. An embarrassing sign of the kind of hypocritical doublespeak at the party. You have Bob just leaving the courthouse, followed by some reporters. These are big stories, but some of them, of course, overshadowed by even larger stories like Trump's trial. If there wasn't a trial of the former president, this I can guarantee you, with my understanding of the news, would be a multi-day national news story. Here is the mugshot of the person that the RNC still claims should be in charge of redeeming election integrity. She is facing justice and accountability. She doesn't have Trump's ability to use presidential references to so slow things down that the Supreme Court buys you an extra 6 months. And her current legal predicament is a bracing contrast to her past claims.
We need everyone to vote. I certainly hope both sides want election integrity.
Donald Trump won the election this week, and Democrats have made a nasty play to steal the presidency.
If you're concerned about, is our election safe? Get involved. There's a pivotal election. Become an election worker, become a poll observer.
That's the contrast. It is a fact that he has, through his lawyering and his privilege and his friends on the Supreme Court, managed to duck the majority of the cases. The trial he currently faces is the only one on deck by the election. And to be clear, it is not the strongest case. I've told you that. And it also pertains to conduct before he ever became president. That's over here. Over here also is a political party, the GOP, that is now openly embracing and doing double down mechanisms to say they're with the Jan 6 defendants and even convicts. But over here is something else that I showed you, which was all the places in this country that nonpartisan prosecutors and the independent justice system and judges are going through the evidence and punishing these people, some of whom say they're sorry and they don't believe the lies anymore, and occasionally some who, as I showed you, say they're waiting on their pardon. It's a mixed picture. It is not the extremes of those who say cynically, we've already lost and nothing works. And it's also not, obviously, hey, look at our perfect legal system and our perfect Supreme Court. Everything's going to be okay. So with that mixed reality in mind, what are citizens going to do as we are in this interregnum before a jury does judge Donald Trump? Ronald Reagan famously said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. We are a long ways from those days of the Republican Party's foreign policy on Russia or in general. The embrace of authoritarianism at home clearly has its own creeping effect on how the party and thus its government leaders view America's place in the world. And then you have the MAGA cheerleaders like Tucker Carlson, who went to interview Putin, and there can be space for those kind of interviews. But if you watched it, and I did, a lot of it was Putin saying whatever he wanted. The leader later said he was surprised there weren't tougher questions from Tucker. Burn. I just don't know how to say that in Russian. Now, Trump, as president, was also quite warm to Putin, and he praised him on the world stage. And Trump continues to back Putin, along with, again, the foreign policy considerations, as more and more of the Republican Party follows his lead in basically laundering or minimizing what Putin's doing in a war that he started in Ukraine, the first land war there since World War II in Europe. The flirtation with dictators is now part of the campaign. We talked earlier in the program about the despicable reference to a, quote, unified Reich in a Trump campaign ad. This embrace of Putin and autocrats, as I mentioned, echoes in Congress.
Yesterday, reporters asked me if I thought President Putin was smart. I said, of course he's smart.
You can tell Putin's on top of his game. One thing he said that it really rung a bell is the propaganda media machine over here. They sell anything they possibly can to go after Russia.
People here in Washington, D.C. are just ignoring that, making people believe like Ukraine can win. No, Ukraine can't. Putin won't lose. Putin will not lose. He's not going to lose.
Putin was actually pretty well behaved during the Trump administration.
This is a mindset that matters. And one of the big questions is, why do people feel this way? And how did a America First conservative political party become this enamored with a foreign autocrat? Our next guest brings a very particular view to this. Jordan Klepper is a member of The Daily Show, known for his comedic and insightful coverage, including a different way to interact with the world of MAGA.
He was talking about how he changed the name from Crooked Hillary to Crooked Joe Biden.
Oh, so he's focusing on the issues?
Yeah.
Great.
China will be paying for the wall.
Shouldn't Mexico pay for the wall?
Oh, Mexico, sorry.
He's evolved this presidency into a dictatorship that we could all understand.
Exactly.
Trump says it's a cult, blah, 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 but I feel like cult is such a negative word. We are not a cult.
What was your first rally?
January 6, 2020.
That's
in D.C.
If you're going to go to one.
Go to one.
Well, have fun. Hopefully, try not to overthrow any duly elected officials.
Yeah, that was a big one. His new special, Moscow Tools. And we're also joined by Vanity Fair correspondent Molly Jong-Fast, host of the podcast Fast Politics. Welcome to both of you.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
You do it different.
Do I?
A little.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What is it?
What you're doing.
What I'm doing, talking to people. I talk to people differently, sure. I follow up. I look for the hypocrisies and the ironies. And
let's start here. We'll get serious. But let's start with what you're doing. Are you looking for jokes first and the insight or the commentary comes after, or are you really trying to make a point?
Well, I think, Daily Show, we look for BS. And we are a comedy show. We wear a bias on our sleeves. You know who we are when we walk out there. So we are looking for humor. And I think we want to make that always very clear. When we walk in that field, we find humor in hypocrisy, hyperbole. And I think, and honestly, what is interesting about it is what becomes revelatory is the things that people would perhaps tell their friends and not tell a regular news media person. And so I think what I prep back in the studio is jokes, ways to contextualize it. But what we really kind of figure out a blueprint for is like, what are the hypocrisies and the questions people haven't followed up with a lot of these people.
Yeah.
From that, let's try to find some humor in it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, we've seen this style with, of course, The Daily Show, as I mentioned, sort of the Stuart Disciple. We've seen some other political documentarians do it. Sacha Baron Cohen does his sort of gonzo version of it. Mm-hmm. You can go all the way back to Hunter S. Thompson if you want. Here's a little bit of you with some of these MAGA folks in Moscow Tools. Let's take a look.
I would like to see America be more in that, like Russia.
You see the streets in Russia, people are walking around, they all seem to be happy.
Who's a better leader, Vladimir Putin or Joe Biden?
Putin.
He's well-mannered. He speaks well.
Putin is well-mannered, right?
Absolutely.
He knows where the fork goes, where the knife goes, which window the journalist goes out of.
Unless, you're the murder journalist.
Exactly.
So when you look at Putin, I don't think it's an insult. I'll say this about Americans in general. We have a much less awareness of a lot of other countries than in other parts of the world where you go and people, it's a survival skill to know about neighboring countries, right? I don't think most Americans can name 20 world leaders, and yet Putin, you can.
Sure.
His infamy that has turned to a type of fame that you document there, what are you finding when you talk to MAGA voters about that? Is that coming down from Trump? Does it have to do with the rejection of American democracy? What are you hearing?
I'm seeing a couple different things. One, we ran into a woman out on the road who talked about how much she used to watch Putin videos of him riding horses shirtless, as if those were cat videos. She found that fun and appealing to her. That, for her, that comes from Trump saying that he's a strong man. He likes that he's a strong man. But also that Tucker Carlson interview that resonated with almost everybody we talked to.
They saw that interview.
They saw that interview. They talked about Moscow being beautiful. I mean, you sniff a ciabatta bread and suddenly everybody thinks that's the place to be. So I think there's part of that crew that uses that as an excuse to be negative towards Joe Biden. I like Moscow is great, which means America is crap because Joe Biden. Is this a way for us to attack Joe Biden? So it's some of that. But I also think there's an element of this, too, that, actually is a little bit of a darker side of the modern Republican movement. It likes the authoritarian side of things. And so we saw that starting to bubble up when we were on the road.
Do you ever have moments where people hear what they're saying and go, oh?
No, that's just a liberal fantasy that happens here. Oh, yes, that confronted with the truth. You're so smart.
They never have a moment where they go wait a second.
I think a lot of times people, we are so insulated.
Right.
They are surprised by being pushed to really think through how they arrived at this decision. That, to me, is what is most revelatory about some of these pieces. But rarely are they challenged to actually rethink why they think that. Yeah. They will chalk that up, and they've been given the blueprint to if they feel embarrassed or small on a media program, that's the media's fault. That's not their own problems getting there.